Hi, everyone. It's indeed my great pleasure to be with Dr. Heath Carter here right now. And Dr. Heath Carter is one of the dynamic personality I have met here around while Princeton. And Dr. Heath Carter is an associate professor of American Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary. He teaches and writes about the intersection of Christianity and American public life, and also lots of academic boards and institutions of the Presbyterian Church. He's a very busy professor here, and Dr. Carter, thank you very much.
I'm so delighted to be here. It's been so good to get to know you this year.
Thank you very much. And as you know, I'm here at Princeton Theological Seminary writing the history of the Presbyterian Church, past, present, and future. And the more focus is on history, theology, Missiology, and Doxology of the Presbyterian Church in Pakistan. And because Presbyterian Church of Pakistan started 1853, or before that actually, in Punjab Mission 1830s with John C. Lowry, and the Princeton Theological Seminary and the theology which we call Hodge theology, right? We are sitting in the Hodge Hall, by the way. So it's impacted a lot. And I mentioned in my research also that 40% Presbyterian missionaries who went to India, they were from Princeton graduate. And me as embodiment of the fruit of that field as a fourth generation, and Dr. Carter here keeping the legacy of the academic excellence here at Princeton. Dr. Carter, as you are professor and history here, American religion also, and other day we were listening to your lecture in Nassau Presbyterian. So my first question to you is, in American Presbyterian history until today, what critical issues divide the PCUSA, or what were the segments happen, the critical segments until today?
Yeah. So thanks so much for the good question and the invitation to speak. I think there have been a number of issues that have divided Presbyterians over the last several hundred years. I spoke in this talk that you referred to at Nassau about 5 of them. I mean, one being, is our faith unchanging? Do we carry forward the ancient confessions, or do we from time to time need to re-examine our faith and update it in light of the ways that the world has changed, and maybe a sympathetic read would say the new things that God has revealed to us. That's been a central axis of disagreement for Presbyterians from the moment they arrived in North America. And there were immediately debates about whether or not the Westminster Confession had to be hewed to in its every article, or whether there was a little bit more room to kind of disagree with aspects of that confession. And so from already in the early 18th century, you get the Adopting Act of 1729, which is an attempt to kind of create a compromise and to allow both to uphold the kind of historic Christian faith, but also to say, but you don't have to agree about every single piece necessarily. And that's been a perennial debate that runs through the fundamentalist modernist controversy and fights here at Princeton Seminary between conservatives and more moderate Presbyterians in the early 20th century that resulted in J. Gresham Machen taking a group to Westminster in Philadelphia. So that's one big axis of disagreement. I mean, there's been huge disagreements about revivals and about the status of revivals. Folks have worried that revivals, by which I just mean the kind of the experiences oftentimes in groups of God touching someone's heart or someone's life in a particular way. Presbyterians often worried about whether there was an element of like too much human intervention in the revival, as opposed to a kind of strict Reformed understanding of divine sovereignty and God is always doing the work. So there's been nervousness about revivals. Oftentimes revivals have also brought folks from different denominations together into a space, and that was for some Presbyterians also a source of some worry. So some of the big splits in Presbyterian history have been about what we think about revivals. This 18th century split between the new side and the old side, the 19th century split between the old school and the new school. Revivalism is partly implicated in those splits. Also, I mean, relatedly are these questions about, can we work with Christians with whom we disagree? And so, Presbyterians early in the, story of the United States forged a partnership with Congregationalists who were allied in certain ways, but who also have different polity and have different theology and don't necessarily hold to all of the same ideas. Some Presbyterians have been excited to pursue those kinds of partnerships. Others have not. This would be replicated in the 20th century with the kind of Protestant ecumenical organizations like the Federal Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches, and the questions around whether Presbyterians could be full participants in these ecumenical ventures. So that's been another big one. How to engage in public life has been a huge area of disagreement. Obviously, in the United States in particular, the Presbyterian Church was divided literally for over 100 years over the question of slavery and race. The sectional crisis and the struggle over slavery and racism in the mid-19th century ended up dividing the church into regional churches, northern and southern, and they didn't come together again until 1983. So that's been a huge, and Presbyterians have disagreed about all kinds of other issues too, obviously, about war, about economic life and all this kind of stuff, but slavery was a huge and enduring divide. And then finally, I talked about how we've also disagreed about who can be ordained, whether women can be ordained, these kinds of issues, and who can lead in the church. So there's just some. There's many more things that Presbyterians have been in conflict about, but those are some of the big ones.
Well, thank you very much. And I know it's a long history, but so the two follow-up questions concerning this one. Number one is currently there was a big shift of eco-Presbyterians.
Yeah.
I think they drift away from the PCUSA. Do you have any comment? What was the main core issue in your opinion?
Yeah. I think for the ECHO, as I understand it, I'm not super familiar with them. My understanding is that the ECHO ordains women, but not gay and lesbian folks.
So more conservative side, actually.
It's a moderate, but conservative on questions of sexuality. That's my understanding.
Okay, wonderful. And so the Union Presbyterian Church, because in Pakistan, still there are a few churches, they take the notion of United Presbyterian Church. Mm-hmm. But in my understanding, I think, as you mentioned, 1980s or somewhere 1990s, there were a union which named PCUSA. Yeah. So before PCUSA, what was their fragmentation and the titles and how they merged in PCUSA?
There's been, I think at the Nassau talk, I shared this chart that shows you all of the different Presbyterian branches that have, been there through the years. PCUSA is created in 1983, I believe, with the reunion of the northern and southern churches finally. But right before that, in 1958, I think it was the creation of the United Presbyterian Church. Okay. Which brought together another communion with the Northern Church, and but then there's the Presbyterian Church USA actually is also back at the beginning. Mm-hmm. So all the way through, there's kind of a winding road, but you get the United Presbyterian Church in the mid-20th century.
Mid-20th century. So probably, if you are aware, otherwise you can avoid this question. This is a big issue in Pakistan. Yeah. And this is a split of the 1968 when Karl McIntyre movement here also influenced PCUSA somehow. Yeah. Do you have any take on Karl McIntyre and his influence of the split in USA, because that funneled down to various parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, McIntyre, as I understand it, is a fundamentalist leaning, kind of much more conservative type Presbyterian who would have been on kind of the Machen side of the. And I'm not super familiar with McIntyre, but as my understanding, he's sort of aligned with the Machen, maybe a little more less of an intellectual than Machen, but there's a cohort of Presbyterians who form the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, who are of the conviction that in some ways a liberal Christian is worse than no Christian at all, and that in fact liberal Christianity is not true Christianity, and you can't partner with folks with whom you disagree in that way, and so McIntyre would have been a part of that world that's more interested in kind of more of a sectarian version of the church where we can't all agree to disagree within the church. So I mean, it's kind of that the third conflict about whether we can work with people with whom we disagree. McIntyre is going to be part of the school that says no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, for the Pakistani friends and the Presbyterian friends in Pakistan, this huge battle in the Gujranwala and the Battle of Pasrur. Even the Presbyterian Historical Society written a couple of articles which titled that battle, where the huge conflict and the split, and the first ever split in the PCP, which actually it was not Presbyterian Church in Pakistan that time, but 1968 was the Battle of Pasrur, when there was a first conflict and the fragmentation of the Presbyterian Church. And still today, even 2024, we still are we are still ripping actually and becoming more fragmented. So that's the important piece for Pakistani Church and the Presbyterians also. Well, thank you very much for commenting on that. Well, my second question is, what formed Presbyterian worship practices? Because generally, even in Pakistan, when there was a union of the Anglicans, Lutherans, Methodists, they formed Church of Pakistan. Yeah. Presbyterian decided to stay away. So, as a professor of Christianity here, and especially at the Princeton, what are the main core kind of principles of Presbyterian worship which would differ from other Reformed traditions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think often, Presbyterians, they come out of a kind of Calvinist tradition, the Reformed tradition more broadly, and one of the features of the Reformed tradition going way back was a kind of interest in the Psalms and singing the Psalms. That's been a kind of constant. You notice in the chapel we have the Psalm book. We have it at Nassau Church. But also an openness to singing other kinds of hymns as well. So it's not been exclusively Psalms. Often Presbyterian worship has been known for kind of austerity, being it's sort of simple. It's not deeply ornate. You're not going to always get the sort of smells and bells that you get in some of the other liturgical churches. It is a liturgical church, but a relatively spare, more sparse kind of liturgy. And obviously a major role for the preacher, and preaching has played a big role in the Reformed tradition as well.
Well, thank you very much. And as a student of a global worship, and also being a president of the School of Church Music and Worship in Pakistan, which is also Presbyterian school, and it's interesting to know that that Presbyterian mostly, although we go with the 4-part or the 4-part pattern of the worship, but primarily the focus is on the centrality of God's word, and which is through singing psalms, and which is through preaching and a sermon. That's why the preacher and the pulpit is the centrality. And even if you go to Gujranwala Theological Seminary, you always see the pulpit is in the middle of the chapel. So that's where the preacher, and mostly Presbyterian seminaries, I think chapels, they have a pulpit in the middle.
No, that's right.
And the table, fellowship table, Holy Communion.
No, that's right.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, one important thing which is related to my research here is a shift of mission theology in the Presbyterians. And you already commented in your lecture also. But there are certain shifts you probably have been seen from sending and getting away, and then currently the short-term mission trips also, but then the partnership with the locals, and still it's sad for me actually, especially I don't know for the PCUSA or not. Since 2021, it's almost 3 years, and still Asia doesn't have any representative from PCUSA. The seat is still vacant, and there is no connection. I don't know how they are dealing with that. But in your opinion, how does the shifts in the mission theology impacted local and also global missions?
Well, you should really be the one answering this question, but I'll give my own go. I mean, I think, as I mentioned on Sunday in the Nassau lecture, I mean, I think that in the 20th century, in the mainline Presbyterian, world in the U.S., you do get a kind of rising worry about foreign missions and about the ways that the kind of missions have been intertwined with colonialism and intertwined with imperialism, and maybe have sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly contributed to some of the things that we as Christians lament. And so I think partly as a result of that, you do have in kind of mainline Presbyterian worlds a pretty deep rethinking of what missions should be. Partly that involves a turn toward kind of indigenization of mission, and the idea that it shouldn't be white U.S. born missionaries who are carrying this work out, but it should be the mission should be kind of claimed and driven by folks who are from that cultural context. So I think that's a big piece. I mean, you also do get a step back from kind of, I think this has been a worry in more conservative Presbyterian circles, that in the U.S. and more liberal or mainline circles, that there can be a step away from evangelism, and that becomes less of an emphasis, and maybe the emphasis becomes more on development or more on these kinds of things. And so I think, it's at the local level, I think that the change is going to be, it would be fascinating to like chart that change over time. I think it'd probably be slow moving, and a lot of churches are going to still support missions of different kinds, and there is a sense that it's important, but also probably a sense that we're not sure what we think about it at the local congregational level, and that we're not sure what, people want to be generous, but they're not sure whether if they had to divert their giving to a particular place, would it be to that or should it be to something else? People might be more keen to give it to certain kinds of international development than they would to mission in particular through a church.
Well, that is one of the critique on Presbyterian overall, and probably you can comment on that here, because that impacted a lot theological education. And somehow, because the primary purpose of the foreign mission or the local mission, even the earliest when there was the British Puritans on that side, evangelism, that was the main focus, preaching the gospel, conversion. That was the early motives behind the missions. But since the education, as you mentioned, social development, the community development, more that switch to the social action rather than the evangelization or the preaching of the word. So does that impacted on the theological education as well as on the church growth here? Because that's one of the impact, probably you point to that in your lecture also, that when church was rigorous in their evangelism outside, and then when they come back, there were a transformed mind, and that impacted here. So since post-COVID, theological education around the world is impacted upon that. Do you think that could be a possibility that if we rejuvenate evangelism, that could be rejuvenated again as it in the beginning? Is there any pattern you can comment on that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think certainly the things that I just mentioned have also been, have impacted theological education without a doubt. It would be interesting to know. So you're wondering, would a return to evangelism reinvigorate the denomination? It's a fascinating question. This is a fascinating moment for Presbyterianism in the U.S. in that the numbers are shrinking. And especially in the mainline, PCUSA, the numbers of folks in PCUSA are shrinking. I think it would be interesting to ask, what would it look like to do evangelism with integrity in a way that the PCUSA kind of theologically could stand behind? And I think that's something that the denomination should be thinking about, because it is, fundamentally the question of like, is the gospel good news, and is there, I think I mentioned this at the end of the talk at Nassau, that I do think that the world needs a joyful, generous gospel, and for us to be really thoughtful about how we testify to the good news that we know is a good question. And I don't know. I wonder what the impact would be. I wonder what you think about that even. But
it's interesting because coming from cross-cultural perspective, and then working since last decade, I'm in the USA and engaging Indian Pakistani immigrants here in California. And so I think there's a lots of potential in that direct evangelism, because currently even in north part of, and even in the Punjab Indian side, not Pakistani side, there is a huge movement. Even government is taking notice, and even the Sikh gurdwaras. So they are the conservative Sikhs. They are protesting in the streets. That what's happening to the Sikhism, because Christianity and the public place, they are sweeping out, especially to the outcast Sikhism. So there's lots of agitation. But anyway, so I think there's lots of potential if PCUSA and the mission, if they reevaluate their mission thinking and the mission theology, I think that will help them, and if they have a global voices, because demographic is changing here in USA also. Well, connecting back to your last question, last comment on the connection with the formation with the Western colonial history, and do you think is it still continuing somehow in the form of NGOs, in the form of a non-government, in the form of trusts, in the form of various modern styles of imperialism? Do you think there is still church connecting with these kind of practices, explicitly or implicitly?
Yeah. There's no question that the kind of global power imbalances remain, and that Christianity is certainly caught up in these things. Obviously, there's been a lot of work to, as we were saying, like rethink missions, rethink the ways that we engage in the wider world. But there's like enormous complexity and enormous challenge and great inequality enduring in the world, and oppressive structures. And surely, we're all, the United States is a part of that story, and Christians here in the US, I think, aren't always even thinking a lot about the ways that our lives are bound up in those structures of global injustice. But surely they are, and surely they demand more of our attention. I think this is one of the insights of kind of the world Christianity literature, is also saying that we need to pay more mind to the voices of Christians in other parts of the world, and to hear from them and to learn from them about what our faith is calling us to do in this moment.
Well, connecting to that, second last question is, there was a Nevius plan in the American history, and that was 3-cell formula. At some context it's worked, at some contexts it's failed. Like I was reading another book from Egypt, scholar, and then in my own Pakistani context, 3-cell formula failed over there, because there were a self-governing, there were a self-propagating, and there were a self-supporting. Nothing is happening. And then that's the one piece missing with the theological education, because mostly the missionaries, they purchase huge properties with the colonial powers, prime properties, but they kept the power of the land in their hand. It was not handed over. So there was some kind of, I see the broken link and a broken trust toward the locals. So they were handling them the already enterprises, but they were not giving them the power to use that. So that really failed. And that also created, which I called, I'm using the post-colonial theory from Homi Bhabha, mimicry of the colonial masters. So the whites gone out, and the brown officers or the brown colonials get the power.
Right.
Because they were in the system. And that created an elite class. Still, it's there. They're behaving like officers. They're behaving like a colonial masters. So what's your take on this 3-cell formula, where they have only 3-cell, but they forgot to add self-theologizing, contextual theology, because that was the force behind it. Did you have any observation on that failed plan?
I think I agree with what you're saying, and I don't have a lot to add. I think what you're saying about the kind of ways in which the legacies of colonialism are felt even after European and U.S. kind of empires vacate, that makes complete sense to me. And maybe the inability of our own ways of theologizing and engaging to really address that in its fullness, that just makes a lot of sense to me.
Because while I'm exploring the history now, I have seen that there was earliest in the Presbyterians hierarchy, where even the local Indians, they were not part of the missionary councils, because they think that we are coming with the Princeton theology, coming with the Westminster theology, coming with the American idea to think and they don't have. So that's why we can only produce people, those who can manage what we offer them to do, rather than thinking by their own. And that's still part of the curricula. So they're just producing managers, not critical thinkers, not theologians. So that's impacting also the theological education, one of the missing part which we talked earlier. So my last question to you is, looking ahead, what do you envision as the beacon of hope for American Christianity, especially here? And then what is currently grappling with the challenges of aging and decline as we talk about the mainline churches?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I guess for me, the hope is, I mean, I think that the kind of American Christendom, as we've known it, this powerful Protestant kind of empire that existed here in the United States, is crumbling. And there's a lot of nostalgia for the past, which was a time when, you know, mainline Protestants, Presbyterians, and more wielded a lot of power and influence in American society. I guess the thing that's hopeful for me is that if you look at that past with a clear eye, I think you'll see that there were ways in which we weren't faithful. There were ways in which there were real serious problems with that kind of old thing. And as it crumbles, I think we can mourn aspects of it. But I also believe deeply that new life is already being born. God is bringing new life out of the ashes of that thing. And I feel a sense of excitement about what that new life may be. And a sense of hopeful anticipation about what that life may be. And I think one of the things I love about being at Princeton Seminary is just the ways that young people who come here to be theologically trained are coming with ideas that we'd never thought of, and hopes and ways of engaging, and that they're gonna teach us and go out and bring new life into congregations and communities. And I just think we don't know what may come, and I feel a sense of excitement, even as this is a time at a macro level where it seems like a time of decline. I think it just may be a time of transformation, and that God may bring new and exciting things in the midst of it.
So what do you think, because as a professor at here in Princeton, and then you have a congregational understanding also, do you think that immigrants, Christian immigrants from coming from Global South, whether they are in academia, whether they are on a congregational life, whether they are in a missional front, do you think that any role these immigrants or Christian diaspora from the Global South can play any role for this new life which we are envisioning and imagining? Could play their part into that?
Yeah, I think no doubt about it. And I think, in fact, you know, in many ways, immigrants are bringing new vitality, new possibilities, creative ideas, creative ways of living out their faith into this context all the time. And that's been an enduring source of vitality for Christianity in the United States, has been the arrival of immigrants, who many of whom have been Christian and are Christian today, and who bring with them, a faith that is often ancient and often creative and new and fresh, and enlivens this place. Absolutely.
One last question, because we covered the doxology, history, and dialogue. Right. So that's actually two follow-up questions. Interfaith. Do you think that PCUSA or the churches of American Christianity here, they need to engage more with the interfaith engagements? And what is the scope of that?
Well, I think we live in a pluralistic society, and so a lot of especially kind of life in the public square, probably it's wise to build coalition and interfaith partnerships, and I think that's a good and neighbor-loving thing to do. And so, I also hope that Christians will find ways even just to build bridges to other kinds of Christians. And I think that's a struggle for us right now in the United States at times, even just within Christian circles, to find ways to hang together in the midst of disagreement is tough. I think there's lots of room for growth in terms of our interfaith engagement, but I also think we need to do better with inter-Christian engagement.
Yeah. So that's interesting. In recent Pakistan, while the war in the Middle East in escalating, and Iran just bombed over the Israel, and the news are saying that Israel is counterattacking. And meanwhile, I'm Pakistan, and Dr. Heath is here. Iranian president visiting Pakistan right now, and we know that how the Shia and Sunni conflict in Pakistan is so deep, but this is the friendship. This is the time when as we are talking about, even the Shiite and Sunnis are getting together for this main in the current situation around the world. And as Dr. Keith is mentioning, concerning not only interfaith but also ecumenical relationships, we actually need to be open to more our Christian brother and sisters also. So one last question, Dr. Keith, Dr. Carter, sorry. So digital. We are living in a digital world. Do you think that the digital platforms can serve or work or help for engaging and rejuvenating of as you mentioned, that the Western, especially North American Protestant Christendom is weakening? What would the role of digital media platforms could play in this concept?
Yeah, I think I'm not excellent on the digital side of things, but I think they have a role to play, and I think they can be tools, and I think they can be useful. I mean, I think they're also imperfect in their ways that they run and the ways that they work, and we should be wary of them too. But no, I think even during the pandemic, you could see how the rise of Zoom allowed people to worship and see one another together, even when they couldn't be together. And I think, I think one of the hallmarks of Christianity in the United States certainly has been finding ways to adapt and use technology as it comes to be. And this goes back even before the U.S. to the rise of the book and the ways that the book played a huge role in the Protestant Reformation. So this is another, and again, we should be cautious and wary where it's appropriate, but also not. I mean, I think we can find ways to embrace and use and learn from and connect through the digital.
Well, wonderful. And you know that you are listening through digital media platform, this video, by the way. So that's what we are talking about. And I'm so blessed to be part of not only the worship community, but also the academic community here, the community of scholars here at Princeton. And as we were listening a lecture yesterday from Dr. The new PhD book author. Yeah. And he mentioned that this generation, and we are really a unique and exceptional generation of scholars as being a part of the overseas ministries and the Princeton and all these exceptional actually institutions. So we were talking about this research project which I'm doing here. It is the past, present, and future of not only the Punjabi Presbyterians, but also as a part of the global community and especially the part of the Presbyterian community and the continuity of the Presbyterian mission overseas in Pakistan and India. And now as a reverse mission, there are thousands and thousands immigrants are coming from India as India across the world population. So what role Indians and Pakistanis can play to rejuvenate the host culture? Almost a century and more than a century ago, Presbyterian missionaries left their homes and they went over there and they served and formed that community. And now God is bringing you back into this nation to help and to rejuvenate and to play your part in the worship life here in the public place also. So God bless you all, as we are talking about. In my hypothesis and my statement in my research is the future of global mission is four-dimensional. Probably I don't know when this video will go out, it could add more, but currently it's doxological, because that's the worship is more important, our identity in the world. Number two is dialogical. So we need to dialogue, whether we enter Christian circles or whether the interfaith. And number three is it's dialogical, it's doxological, and then digital. And that's very important role to play. And lastly is diasporic. That's what we are talking about. So God bless you, play your role, praise God, give your testimony, and help your neighbors and engage and glorify God's kingdom. Thank you very much for watching this. And thank you very much, Dr. Carter, for your time and your valuable insights
of course.
into
Such a
that
pleasure.
research. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course. Yeah.
Thank you.